David Letterman dropped his cue card. Paul Schaefer stopped mid-note. The cameras froze on a face America had never seen before. The man behind the gap-toothed grin completely shattered. For 30 years, he'd interviewed president, roasted celebrity, and never let the mask slip. But when a woman in the third row stood up and spoke 6 words, everything stopped. The band went silent. The audience held its breath. And David Letterman, the king of late-night sarcasm, did something he swore he'd never do on television. He broke. What happened in the next 8 minutes was never supposed to air. NBC tried to cut it, but the tape survived. And what that Vietnam nurse said, what she'd been carrying for 22 years, would change how America saw the man who made them laugh every single night. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like it. It was a Tuesday night in October 1991. Late Show with David Letterman was taping at the Ed Sullivan Theater in Manhattan like clock. The red curtain glowed under tungsten light. Paul Schaefer and the CBS orchestra were in perfect sync. The audience of 300 laughed on cue. Everything was running exactly as it should. David Letterman sat behind his wooden desk, that familiar half-smile playing on his lips. He was wearing a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie, his curly brown hair catching the stage light. The monologue was killing. Jokes about the economy, about politicians, about coffee prices. Classic Letterman. Sharp, dry, Midwestern wit wrapped in a shrug. Ed Sullivan Theater loved. Paul Schaefer played a jazz riff between punch. The cameras caught every practiced angle. This was Late Show at its peak, 30 million viewers a week, the most watched program in America. David Letterman was untouched, but in the third row, 14th seat, a woman sat quietly. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. She was 53 years old, with gray hair pulled into a simple bun. She wore a navy dress, nothing flash, nothing that would draw attention. She'd won her ticket through a radio contest, told her daughter it was just something to do on a Tuesday night. She hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned to stay even. Then something shifted. Letterman was mid-joke, something about inflation, about the price of milk, when his eyes swept the audience. Professional habit. 30 years of reading a room. But this time, his gaze landed on the third row and didn't move. Margaret wasn't laughing, wasn't smiling. She was staring at him with a knife-edge intensity that cut through the stage light. Letterman stumbled. Just for a sec, the joke died in his throat. Paul Schaefer glanced over, eyebrows raised. David Letterman never stumbled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Letterman said, his voice suddenly different, quieter, stripped of performance. "I'm going to do something I've never done before." He set down his card. The studio went silent. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly at Margaret, "would you stand up?" In the control booth, producers went into panic mode. This wasn't in the script. There was no backup plan for it. But the cameras kept rolling, because when David Letterman wanted something, you didn't cut away. Margaret rose slowly. Her hands were shaking. "What's your name?" Letterman asked. "Margaret Sullivan," she said. Her voice barely carried, but the microphones caught it. "Where are you from, Margaret?" "San Diego. Originally Nebraska." Letterman nodded. He'd gone completely off script now, operating on pure instinct, and anyone who knew him could see something was happening beneath the surface. "Were you in the service, Margaret?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "I was a nurse," she said. "Army nursing, 1968 to 1971. Vietnam." The audience stirred. A few people clapped. Uncertain, respectful, but Letterman gently raised his hand, asking for silence. "Thank you for your service," he said. The words came out rough. Something caught in his throat. Margaret nodded. She was still standing, still looking at him with that unwavering gaze. "Mr. Letterman," she said, and her voice was stronger now, "I need to tell you something." What happened next would become the most watched unscripted moment in late-night history. But nobody in that studio, not Paul, not the producer, not even Letterman himself, was ready for what she was about to say. Letterman stepped out from behind his desk. Paul Schaefer's eyes went wide. Doc Severinsen set down his trumpet. This had never happened. Not in 30 years of live television. "Go ahead," Letterman said quietly. Margaret took a deep breath. "In 1969, I was stationed at the 12th Evacuation Hospital in Cu. There was a young soldier there, 19 years old. He'd stepped on a mine. Both legs were gone. He was in and out of consciousness for 3 days. The studio was completely silent now. No cough, no rustling clothes, just Margaret's voice. He kept asking for his mother, kept saying he wanted to go home. We did what we could, but he was fading. On the third night, around 2 in the morning, he opened his eyes, looked at me, and said, 'Can you tell Johnny Carson I watched him with my mom every night?'" Letterman's hand went to his mouth. "We didn't have a TV in the war," Margaret continued, "but I told him I would. I told him Johnny Carson was on right now, and I sat by his bed, and I recited your monologue. I made up jokes. I did Ed McMahon's laugh. For 20 minutes, I pretended to be you." Her voice cracked. "And for the first time in 3 days, he smiled. He smiled. Then he closed his eyes and said, 'Tell Johnny thanks,' and he was gone." The silence in that studio was deafening. Then, in a choice no producer would ever have allowed, David Letterman walked down 3 steps from the stage into the audience. Security tried to stop, but he waved them off. He walked directly to Margaret Sullivan and, without a word, took both her hands and, "What was his name?" Letterman asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Thomas Edward Pritchard," Margaret said. "We called him Tommy." Letterman nodded. His eyes were red. The cameras were still rolling, capturing something that had never been filmed before. Raw, unscripted grief. "Tommy Pritchard," Letterman repeated. He looked out at the audience. "From Iowa, 19 years old, wanted to watch the show with his mother." He turned back to Margaret. "And you sat with him. You gave that to him." "I tried," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now. "I tried to give him home." Letterman hugged. The audience sat in stunned silence. Paul Schaefer covered his eyes with his hand. Doc Severinsen had turned away from the camera. When Letterman finally pulled back, he kept holding Margaret's hand. And what he did next broke every rule of late-night television and changed what the format could be. "We're not going to commercial," Letterman said, looking directly into the camera. "We're not doing jokes tonight. We're going to do something different." He led Margaret back to her seat, but he didn't return to his desk. Instead, he sat on the edge of the stage, legs dangling over like he was sitting on a porch talking to a neighbor. "How many of," he said to the audience, his voice thick, "have lost someone who loved this show, someone who's not here anymore?" Hands went up. First a few, then more, then dozens. The cameras moved through the crowd, young and old, men and women. Hands raised. Letterman nodded. "Then this next hour is for them." What followed was unprecedented. David Letterman spent the next 45 minutes talking to the audience. One by one, they stood and shared names. Fathers who died in Korea, brothers lost in Vietnam, mothers who passed while the TV was on, children taken too soon. Letterman listened to every single. He didn't rush, didn't check his watch, didn't look at the producers frantically signaling from the booth. At one point, a man in the back row stood and said, "My son died in a car accident 3 years ago. He was 17. He used to do impressions of you to make his little sister laugh." Letterman's face crumpled. "What was his name?" Daniel Mark. Daniel Mark," Letterman repeated. 17 years old. Made his sister laugh." He looked into the camera. "If you're watching at home and you've lost someone, write their name down. Put it somewhere you'll see it. Say it out loud, because when we stop saying their name, that's when they really disappear." But the moment that would break Letterman completely, the moment that would define his entire career, was still coming, and it came from the front row. Near the end of the hour, an elderly woman in the front row hesitantly raised her hand. Letterman nodded. "Mr. Letterman," she said, slowly standing, "my husband and I watch every night for 40 years. He passed last month. The night before he died, he made me promise something." "What was it?" Letterman asked gently. "He made me promise I'd keep watch, that I'd laugh for both of us, that I wouldn't let the chair next to me stay empty." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, a smiling man in his 70s, sitting in a recliner with a TV tray in front of him. "This is Harold," she said. He never missed a show. Letterman came down from the stage again. He took the photograph and looked at it for a long time. "Harold," he said quietly, "you had good taste in women." The audience released a soft, cathartic laugh that broke through tears. Letterman looked at the woman. "What's your name?" "Doris. Doris Keller." "Doris, would you mind if I kept this picture just for tonight?" She nodded, eyes wet. Letterman walked back to his desk and placed the photograph right next to his coffee cup, facing the camera. "This is Harold Keller," he told millions of viewers. "He watched for 26 years, and tonight he's still here." The band began to play soft, not the usual energetic theme, but something gentle, something felt. Letterman sat at his desk, his hand resting on Harold's photograph. "We'll be right back," he said, but his voice showed he wasn't. During the commercial break, Letterman didn't move. The audience didn't leave. Margaret Sullivan was still in her seat, crying quietly. Doris Keller was holding the hand of the woman next to her. When they came back from commercial, Letterman looked different, older, some more human. "I've been doing this show for a long time," he said. "I've interviewed presidents, movie stars, people who've done extraordinary things, but tonight was different. Tonight I met real heroes." He looked at Margaret. "And you, ma'am, you're one of them. What you did for Tommy Pritchard, sitting with him, giving him a piece of home in his darkest moment, that's what this country is supposed to be about." The audience erupted in applause. Margaret stood, dazed, and the entire studio rose with her. Letterman waited for the applause to fade, then spoke again. "Before we go tonight, I want to do one more thing." He reached under his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. On one side was the show's cue card. The other side was blank. "Tommy Pritchard," he said, and carefully wrote the name. "I'm going to keep this on my desk every night so I don't forget." He held the card up to the camera. "And I'm asking you at home, if you've lost someone who loved this show, write their name down. Keep it somewhere you can see it, because they were with us, and they still are." The show ended not with the usual upbeat flourish, but with silence. A silence so heavy and unfamiliar that even the cameras seemed reluctant to move. Letterman sat at his desk, the cue card in front of him, Harold's photo placed gently beside it, as if it were made of something fragile that might shatter under the studio light. The credits rolled over, a still shot of him, no witty smirk, no closing joke, no trademark dark eyebrow raised. Just David Letterman, head bowed, shoulders slightly slumped. A man who had spent 30 years making people laugh finally allowing himself, for the first time in front of millions, to cry. The next morning, NBC received over 10,000 letters. They arrived in bags, in boxes, in stacks that employees had to carry with both arms. People sent photographs creased from wallets, Polaroids fading at the edges, school pictures, army portraits, wedding snapshots. They sent names sometimes on index cards, sometimes scribbled on napkins, sometimes written in shaky handwriting from someone elderly who had tried 3 times to make it neat. They sent stories, fragments of lives, memories of husbands, brothers, daughters, mothers, friends who had watched David Letterman every night and were gone now, but who for some reason felt present again after that show. The network didn't know what to do with it. Executives argued about storage, liability, optics. To them, they were mail. To Letterman, they were something else entirely. He had them sent to his home. No intern, no assistants to filter them, he insisted, and he read every single slowly, patiently, sometimes at his kitchen table, sometimes late at night in his office, sometimes sitting alone backstage before a tape. Some he reread multiple times. Some made him laugh soft. Others stopped him mid-sentence, unable to continue for several minutes. And for the next 12 years, until his final show in 2015, he kept Tommy Pritchard's cue card on his desk, just outside the camera frame, tucked at the edge where only he could see it. It was his anchor, his reminder, the small rectangular piece of cardboard that carried more weight than anyone watching at home ever knew. Margaret Sullivan never came back to the show. She didn't need, but she and Letterman corresponded for years. She wrote with the kind of candor that only comes from someone who has lived a lifetime of grief. In one letter, she wrote, "You gave Tommy his last smile, but that night, you gave me something too. You let me say his name out loud. You let him matter." Letterman kept that letter in his desk drawer until the day he retired. When the staff packed his office, he asked that it be placed in a separate envelope, one he'd personally carried out of the building. Doris Keller's photograph of Harold stayed on the Late Show set. Crew members dusted around, careful not to move it even an inch. On his final night, Letterman held it up one last time, his fingers lingering on the edges as though saying goodbye to a friend. "Harold Keller," he said, 26 years, never missed a show. "This one's for you, buddy." Years later, when television historians talked about David Letterman's career, they rarely mentioned this moment. It wasn't in the compilation. It wasn't replayed during anniversary special. It didn't get an Emmy nomination. The network never rebroadcast, and many casual viewers forgot it ever happened. But the people in that studio, the ones who felt the air shift at night, the families watching at home clutching photographs of their own loved ones, they never forgot. Because that night, David Letterman did something no talk show host had done, and very few have done since. He stopped the entertainment and bore witness. He let the jokes fall away. He let the cameras linger. He turned his stage, usually a place for laughter and escape, into a memorial. He let his audience grieve, and he gave them permission to remember. He showed that the power of television wasn't just to make people laugh, it was to make them feel seen, known, remembered. Tommy Pritchard died at 19 in Cuchi. He never made it back to Iowa, never saw his mother again. But in a field hospital, for 20 minutes, a nurse pretended to be David Letterman. She gave a dying soldier a scrap of comfort, a moment of familiarity, a final smile. And decades later, Letterman returned the favor. He made sure Tommy's name was said out loud on national television, so it would never be forgotten. That's the legacy. Not the joke, not the rating, not the celebrity interview, but the night a man stopped the show and said, with absolute sincerity, "Your grief matters. Your loved ones matter. Their names matter." On that Tuesday night in October, David Letterman taught us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply listen and remember, and make sure that, for at least a moment, the world does too. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the video. I always enjoy reading your feedback. Bell subscribe for more real stories about the moment that defined legend. Thumbs up like if this story reminded you that true greatness is about celebrating the success of others. Beachaloon comment. Have you ever had to celebrate someone else's success when you wanted to be the one to shine? How did you handle it? Share your story. Outbox Trey, share this video with someone who needs to learn that there is enough light for everyone. Warning, important disclaimer. This is a fictional story created for entertainment and inspirational purpose. The character, event, and dialogues presented in this video are products of the imagination and do not represent real fact. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. Copyright 2025 Letter. Lost episodes, fictional content created with respect and admiration.